maybe my actions are I yell, I get upset, I say things I regret that I wasn't calm in the moment. But what happened in there was at some point after I experienced what happened, I told myself a story. And then I felt a feeling in response to that story. And then I acted off of those feelings.
You're listening to the Connected Parenting Minute with Will and CarrieAnn Standfest. This podcast is a conversation about parenting, using connection first, trauma-informed principles. Because when you lead with connection, everyone feels seen, which is the foundation to a more peaceful home. This podcast reminds you that you don't have to be a perfect parent, but we can all get a little better, one connected parenting minute at a time.
Hello and welcome back to the Connected Parenting Minute. My name is Will Standfest and I am so glad that you've joined us tonight. With me as always is the lovely CarrieAnn Standfest.
I'm having a fun time tonight. I realized I need to have something besides just saying hello to respond to that.
I love it.
But I'm glad that we're here.
It is good that we're here. Well, we are back for part 2 of our Finding Calm in the Midst of Chaos episode.
That's right, we are. And I thought maybe we'd start out a little bit by kind of recapping some of the points from podcast part number 1.
If you haven't listened to it, definitely go back and listen to it. This is going to be like the 2-minute version of the podcast for those that didn't hear it. Just want to keep going on this one.
Right. So our first point from last time is the lie that peace is just around the corner.
The lie? What do you mean? As soon as soccer season is over, this is all going to calm down, isn't it? Isn't it?
That's such a great point. Of course it will. That's one way to look at it.
Right. And we unpacked this a bunch last episode, but it's just that, there's always going to be something.
Mm-hmm.
And we can't rely on our circumstances to be the thing that calms us down. We've got to find something else.
Right. And the next point was that finding peace is a learned skill.
A learned skill.
Yeah, it's something we have to practice. We talk about practicing what you want to get good at.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Peace isn't just granted to you from on high.
Yep. And then our third point from last week was that the space between not knowing and knowing is full of tension.
Yes, it sure is. It's uncomfortable not knowing.
It can be really uncomfortable. And the more that we choose to recognize that hard does not equal bad in that situation, that it can be difficult, but it doesn't always mean that we need to push it away and we can just settle into that. We get to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because how many times in your life can you look back through a really hard season of life and recognize that was a point where you really grew a lot as a person?
So much so. I think we put a lot of growth off because we don't want to experience hard things. And I don't blame anybody.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm guilty of this too.
I want to avoid hard things if I can help it. But sometimes those are good for me.
Yeah, sometimes.
All right. So we should talk a little bit about the points from this podcast, part 2.
Oh, talk about this week's podcast?
This week's podcast. And actually, we should make note that this is the final episode of season 3 of our podcast.
I know. I'm so sorry, listener. I'm sad too. I would keep going, but we do occasionally need to take a break.
Need to take a break and kind of wrap some stuff up for a little bit and be able to come back with some fresh ideas and some...
We got some neat ideas for next season.
I think we do too.
I'm excited for it.
It'll be good. We're just a little pause for a while.
So there'll be a pause for a couple of weeks with no new episodes. This is your chance to go back and listen to old episodes, get all caught up and all that. You can send us an email if there's any topics or questions you'd love for us to cover next season. I would happily take some suggestions and all that. You use info@connectedparentingminute.com.
I think that's going to be great. And guess what, Will?
What?
I also realized something that'll be fun about next season.
Ooh, tell me.
We get to move back into our recording studio.
Oh, that's right. We're recording in my office right now, my home office. And we're going to move back up to our little studio that we like upstairs.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really fun. That gives us a little more space to be able to write things down on the walls and brainstorm. And
it's more space to keep more ideas out, which helps. Having the right mind, having the right physical location can really put you in the right mind space for having good discussions.
And less interruptions from children.
Yeah.
We don't have to record at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. Anyway, okay, I digress. We should get back to the episode.
All right. Well, CarrieAnn, why don't you tell us what point number 1 is this week?
All right. So when we're talking about calm in the midst of chaos, our first point is that chronic stress is bad for our health.
Chronic stress is bad for our health. I mean, I think I understand that, but how does that relate to the chaos and stuff?
All right. So we were talking about this earlier, and I wanted to unpack this a little bit because we can go, all right, so there is chaos in my house. There's this happening. There's that happening. Once we get through this season, it'll probably be a little less crazy and things will settle down. We already discussed and unpacked that idea that that's a lie and that we can practice having peace. But why?
Yeah. What's the point of all of it?
What is the point of that?
Right. If it's just always going to be chaotic, just let it be chaotic and move on with your life.
But physiologically, like in our brains, it's not healthy for us. And I think most people realize that if you're always stressed out about something, that it's not good for you.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be an example to our kids in that.
Yeah. Ooh. Say more.
Well, there's an element that, children learn things through catching them rather than being taught them. How's the phrase go?
More is caught than taught.
There we go. Words were hard right then. But the reason behind why this is important and recognizing this is because we really do want to show our kids that it's possible to be able to have peace.
Yeah, absolutely. Because our children, just like us, normalize how we grew up.
Mm-hmm.
If we grow up in a chaotic household, we don't feel settled in our own household if it's not a little chaotic. I mean, that's one of the fundamental things they teach that we've learned about foster care and adoption is sometimes a kiddo who's grown up in a loud and crazy and out of control house does not feel settled in a quiet house.
So in actuality, they will unwittingly, not necessarily because they are thinking about this actively, but they will try to cause chaos to feel more comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's it. It blew my mind, but it also made so much sense at the same time when I kind of learned that for the first time is your body craves what it thinks is normal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's just the same goes the opposite way. If you grow up in a house where everybody was very quiet and prim and proper and kind of did their thing and kept to themselves, and you start dating a girl who's got a loud and boisterous family around the dinner table, like it's too much. You can't handle it.
Yeah, for sure. And so we just wanted to take that moment and address why this was important, why we're talking about this, why it is good for us to continue to work towards, because we're not going to be perfect, right?
Exactly.
But there is a reason why we should be working towards this mentality of peace, even when things aren't peaceful.
Yeah, it's because it's good for your own mental and physical health.
Physical health too. Yes.
If we need, we can cite the studies that will tell you how a chronically stressed out mental state will affect your physical health.
I think we need to do an episode on that at some point.
Okay.
With the research.
That would be great.
Yes, that's on the docket.
So your own physical and mental health and well-being, but also for your children and for your grandkids, the home that they're going to end up growing up in is helping model for your kids that finding peace, even when things are busy, is not only possible, but it's worth it.
Exactly. So chronic stress is bad for our health.
It is. So point number 2.
Point number 2 is,
what story are you telling yourself?
What story are you telling yourself? All right, I'm going to get all jacked up on this now because I just finished reading an amazing book, which we will probably unpack further in later episodes, as well as I'm just going to talk about it all the time now because it's my new favorite thing. But Crucial Conversations is the name of the book. And I mean, I think we've had that book sitting on our shelf for probably like 8 to 10 years.
It's been a while,
if I'm being honest. But one day I was looking for a book to read and I couldn't find it. Instead, I was like, oh, we've had this for a while. I should pick it up. And I started reading it and I'm like, oh my goodness gracious, this is amazing. And I've pretty much recommended it to everybody ever since. People are going to get sick of hearing me talk about this book.
You were going to recommend it to someone tonight.
Yes, actually, I may just buy it for that person. So our point was, what story are you telling yourself? And I had to take a moment because I have my glasses on, but I actually cannot see very well the little tiny notes we have posted on the wall. So
it's almost like we had a studio and we could mount the notes in a better place. And
that's true. And I could actually see them. All right. here's how we go. Okay, so you grew up and I grew up. Obviously, we're adults.
Are we?
Theoretically, our age indicates that we should have some experiences.
Okay, that's fair.
I remember being told when I was a kid, somebody can't make you feel angry, mad, sad, hurt, whatever. Like they can't physically make you feel feelings.
Okay, yeah.
All right. And I agree with that, right? Nobody can say, "Ooh, I want to make you happy," and try to make you happy.
Well,
they can try.
They can try to make you happy, but they can't cause you to feel happy.
Right. I mean, they can do all the nice things and funny and whatever, but they can't actually make you feel that feeling.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
But we often use the terms, he made me mad, she made me angry, and so on, right? But
sure.
But they can't actually physically make us feel those feelings.
Okay.
But here's what happens. We witness or experience something. Maybe somebody dropped a plate and it shattered in a million pieces on the floor.
Mm-hmm.
And then we think we feel a feeling and then we react from that feeling. Okay. So I feel angry. I can't believe that you would drop that plate. And maybe my actions are I yell, I get upset, I say things I regret that I wasn't calm in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But what happened in there was at some point after I experienced what happened, I told myself a story.
Mm.
And then I felt a feeling in response to that story. And then I acted off of those feelings.
Interesting.
So let's unpack that just a little bit.
Yeah. Keep going.
All right. So I experienced someone dropping a plate. In there, in a microsecond, I may not have even actively thought about that. I told myself the story that person was just not being careful, that they're being careless, that they didn't care about the things that were important to me, or that they were being hurried, or that they were XYZ, 100 different stories that I could tell myself in that moment. And then I had a feeling of reaction to that.
Mm.
And then I acted.
Yeah. Okay.
We do this all the time.
Yeah. That's interesting. Because you don't know why that person dropped the plate.
No, you don't.
And your brain thrives off a story.
Mm-hmm.
Every interaction you have, your brain tells yourself a story.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you don't have the motivation, the reason, all that stuff, your brain wants to fill it in.
Exactly.
And from that, you end up assigning motives or feelings or thoughts that the other person may or may not have had.
Yes. And we do this all the time. And
all the
most
time.
Interactions that we have. Well, it's a little easier when we're calm and when we can think through things and we're curious. But the moment that our brain starts flipping into the amygdala, fight, flight, or freeze, we're not thinking with that prefrontal cortex, with the front part of our brain.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to jump to conclusions. So when I say, what story are you telling yourself? It's kind of summing that all up in a really, really quick way.
Yeah.
But I think we definitely have to do another episode on this because I feel like there's so many things to unpack after I get you to read the book.
Oh, I just got assigned homework. Y'all hear that? Man.
But it's fascinating to me.
That's a really neat concept, that idea that recognizing that, goodness, any situation at work, any situation with your kids, even with your spouse. I mean, that's how many times is at the heart of a conflict between a husband and a wife is some kind of awkward interaction. And then you both walk away and you tell yourselves a story of why the person reacted that way.
Well, I don't know if you realized this.
Uh-oh.
But I've started doing that. Sometimes I think there was an instance where not too long ago, you were having a morning or something was going on and you were kind of a little bit out of it, maybe a little bit short. And I eventually said, I'm telling myself the story that I did this. And as a result, you are upset with me and this, that, and the other thing. And you're like, that's not it at all. But I had to recognize in myself that I was telling myself a story rather than get upset at you. I could say, hey, I notice you're acting this way. And this is what I'm telling myself. Is that true or not?
I remember that the other day. And I was like, no, I'm tired. Or like, it's completely innocuous. But you expressing that this is not only how it came off to you, but kind of the story that you're filling in because of that gave me the chance to stop and take a moment and be able to kind of clear the air and whatever and You didn't spend the whole day beating yourself up over something or resenting me or whatever, whatever it was.
Right. Which I may have done in the past is like, oh, obviously he's really mad at me because of this, or I said something out of turn, or, and that doesn't happen a ton, but just taking the moment of me recognizing that I was filling in the blanks and it really didn't have anything to do with what you were saying or doing, but I was taking that on myself. I mean, it helped that diffuse that situation pretty flawlessly. But it took a couple minutes and a cup of coffee.
That's awesome. That's a great example. So before we run out of time, we should probably cover point number 3.
Right. But point number 2 is so good.
It is
so good.
It's very good. You guys should read the book while I read the book, and then we'll have a whole conversation at the podcast community.
Right. All right. What is point number 3, Will?
Point number 3 is mind the gap.
Mind the gap. That sounds familiar.
If you've ever been to London Underground, it's very familiar. I don't think you have, but I have.
Not.
I have. Mind the gap. A proper British lady says it over the thing. So you're supposed to not trip into the gap between the train and the platform.
Okay. So this is like in the subway? Because I haven't been there. You just reminded me. I've just heard it before.
It's not the subway. It's the London Underground. It's completely different, darling.
Okay. How is that different than a subway?
Shh, quiet.
I've only been in one subway my entire life.
If there are British people listening, they'll be very offended.
Okay. It's the London Underground.
It's the London Underground.
Okay. So I'm still catching up on this.
If you've never been to London, it might seem like a subway.
Okay. Fair enough. Potato.
So mind the gap. When this comes to situations with our children, or chaos or calm, or fighting to find calm in the midst of chaos, mind the gap is, like you said, there's a split second between what happened and you reacting to it that we have to recognize there is a gap there.
Mm-hmm.
There's a gap between a situation happening and how we react to it. And this is a principle that they'll teach you in any kind of like behavioral improvement courses. Like when people are struggling with whatever negative behavior it is they want to correct. That's one of the first things that they'll teach you is this idea that you feel like as soon as you're in the situation, you just automatically react that way. And it's not true. As quickly as it happens, and when you are deep into a negative behavior that you want to stop, sometimes that happens very, very quickly. But even as quickly as it happens, it is not an instantaneous reaction. There is a moment in there between entering a situation or something happening to you and how you react to it. And if you can find that gap, and make that a little bit wider, that gives you a chance to think, right? Because when you're in your survival brain, fight, flight, or freeze, you can't think logically. It's offline. You're just reacting. If your limbic system's in reacting to it, you're just emotions and your feelings just all come out sideways and all that. You got to get a little bit of a gap, just enough time for your logical thinking part of your brain to say, hold on, this is not how I want to react in this situation anymore. I want to do this differently.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like we're actually trying to make space between the interaction and our reaction to be able to choose.
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole proactive versus reactive concept, right? You don't want to just react to what your children do. You want to plan ahead and have an idea of how you want to react in this situation.
Yeah. That sounds a lot like what we talk about in one of our workshops with scripting our responses.
Yeah. I think we've brought it up on the podcast before, but the idea of scripting your response, if you're not familiar, is when you have a repeated situation with your kiddo and you know it's going to happen again in the future, just come up with a response that you're okay with.
That even seems to me like we could be, if we know that we react badly when someone breaks a plate.
Yeah.
Or someone dumps a cup of milk on the floor, where we know that maybe that's a hairpin where we kind of lose our stuff really, really quickly. Minding the gap sounds like we anticipate when those things happen, we almost underreact to them.
Yeah.
So we allow ourselves time to figure out how we want to react in the situation. I don't know. I was just thinking about that because I think sometimes when I've been in really stressful situations and I've kind of tried to work on training myself to ask questions, to slow everything down because I want to jump right into either the solution or the reaction. And that's not what I want to do. I want to mind that gap. And I just want to like, I put it in slow motion, so to speak.
Yeah.
So that I have time for my thinking brain to catch on and decide what's going to happen. That's where really good technique for that is repeating a question.
That's so good. It's so simple, especially when your teenager comes up to you and asks you some wildly inappropriate, completely out of context, or a question that you would like to say, hey, can I go out with my buddies? And you're like you want to say in like 3.2 milliseconds, heck no.
Right?
What is wrong with you? You can like try to get a little bit of a gap there and say, can you go out with your buddies tonight on a school night? And it's 10:30 already. Say more about that.
Exactly.
Like you just repeat it back to them and like ask for some clarification, and it gives you a little bit of a gap.
Yeah.
Right? Because when they ask you those ridiculous questions, or they go to bed way past their bedtime, or whatever it is that's, that you're struggling with, being able to get a little bit of a gap between the it happened again and I react to it is where you're going to be able to kind of get your reactions and your responses under control and to where you want them to be.
No, I love that. We actually just brainstormed that on the spot. So that's great. Thank you for being here so we could talk about this and get more ideas for our own family. Because like I said, this podcast is a blessing to me because then I actually have to talk and think about the things that we do and keep learning and growing because I do want to keep getting better as a parent.
Well, that's what this is all about because, this whole podcast is about us sharing things that other people have shared with us and things that have helped us, things that have worked, things that have not worked. And we want to share it with you guys because if people weren't brave enough and courageous enough to share what they learned with us, we would not be where we are. And the things we have learned have like transformed our home and have rebuilt relationships where we've screwed up and have made relationships possible where they wouldn't have been.
Exactly. All right. We need to wrap up this episode. What was point number 1, Will?
Point number 1 was that chronic stress is bad for our health.
So it's important to keep trying for the sake of ourselves and for the sake of our kids to figure out how to live in peace, even when things can be chaotic.
Absolutely. And point number 2.
What story are you telling yourself?
Because there is a story. We don't have all the details of every situation that we get into. So we need to recognize that we are filling in that story. And in doing that, we may be assigning blame or motives that we don't necessarily know are there.
Point number 3 is
mind the gap.
Mind the gap. Really what we're saying in that is give yourself space in between the interaction and your response. Because when we give ourselves slow things down just enough to let our prefrontal cortex, our thinking brain kick in, we can respond how we want to rather than how we might feel in that exact moment.
I love what you just said there. Instead of making a moment from the interaction to the reaction, you want a moment from the interaction to the response. Going from reacting to responding. Boom.
There we go. That sounds like a perfect way to end this season.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us for season 3 of the podcast. We have been blessed to share these episodes with you. If you could take a minute, it would really help us out. You could jump over to Spotify and leave us some stars. Head over to Apple Podcasts, leave us a review, or subscribe and comment on YouTube. Anything you can do to share a little bit of love for the podcast or share an episode or 2 that's impacted you with one of your friends helps us out so very much. We appreciate every single one of you listening, and we just want to remind you,
you don't have to be a perfect parent,
but we can all get a little bit better, one connected parenting minute at a time.
Thank you for listening to my mom and dad's podcast. Make sure you put a like and subscribe. If you like this episode, tell all of your friends about it. See you next time.
For more parenting tips or to connect with us, check out the Connected Parenting Minute on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Or you can send us an email using connectedparentingminute@gmail.com.